Yeah, but
And we're on. All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Hi, YouTube. If you don't want to be on YouTube, stay behind that camera or stay over in that direction. But welcome, everyone. For the couple people I don't know, I'm Hannah. That's Ian over there, and Chris in the back. And we are the organizers, so if you have any questions, let us know. We're going to talk all about Monero today, but a couple of things first. We run off donations, so if you're feeling generous today, there's a Bitcoin QR code and a jar or fiat. We will have pizza later after the talk, probably after Q&A and all is when it will arrive. So let's all sit and do the talk, and then afterwards we can hang out and eat pizza for a while, and then usually some of us wander off to the bar after this, so maybe we'll do that today as well. We also usually do lightning talks. Are there any takers today? Does everyone know what a lightning talk is? Any one of you can come up here and tell us whatever you want the Chicago crypto community to know about, some project you're working on, or if you're looking for help with something, etc. So 2 minutes. I think we had one person that was going to, but I don't see him. So anyone else interested?
I might be.
Okay. You want to go up and do lightning talk?
Yeah.
Well, come on up, and you get 2 minutes and only 2 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
I get a stopwatch going.
Okay.
And go.
Yeah. So right now I'm doing a EOS smart contract options, as in trading options platform. Maybe I might eventually change it to or add another type of option contract with EOS smart contracts, but doing more like an insurance type of platform. But right now, probably the only issue I have right now with this would be just kind of doing the test environment. I just need some help with setting up the Docker. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bill. He has a master's in math and a PhD in computational physics, and now works at the Monero Research Lab. So very well qualified to tell us all about Monero. Please welcome Sreng.
Hello. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the hosts and to the venue for hosting, and hello to everyone on the internet. You can see me too. I'm not going to stand in front of a bright light. So my real name is Aaron. I go by Sreng Noether online, and as everyone said, I am a full-time researcher with the Monero Research Lab, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means. And I'm going to talk a little bit more generally today about privacy technology in blockchain applications, but I'll focus a lot on Monero in particular because it's what I know best. But we'll talk about other projects as well. Hopefully keep it pretty informal, so if you have specific questions on things that I talk about, feel free to jump in, and then I guess at the end we can do more general questions, or after the event if we're all hanging out. That's cool too. I love to talk about this. So let's go and get started. First of all, I always give usual disclaimers that all these views are just mine, and Monero is a very decentralized project, as we'll talk about, so I don't necessarily represent Monero Research Lab or the Monero project in a lot of the views that I'll express here. Keep in mind, I do get funding from the Monero community to conduct research for Monero and the Monero Research Lab, so you should view that as a conflict of interest for anything I talk about relating to Monero. And finally, of course, none of this is endorsement or financial advice. So, very, very briefly, what is Monero, just kind of as a big 30,000-foot view? How does it operate? How does it do research? And then we'll talk about some of the technology later, but we won't go into huge, gory mathematical depth. We kind of did that a bit in the workshop, but if there's questions on that, I can, of course, answer it. So, at its heart, Monero is a cryptographic asset project. I hate the term cryptocurrency. I think it implies things that maybe aren't actually what they do. I prefer things like digital asset or cryptographic asset. And in particular, it is an open source project, as many such projects are. But it's a little bit different in that it is, I like to say it's kind of aggressively decentralized. So all of the development, all of the research, all of the testing, all of the funding even for everything that we do is all by the community. So there is no company, there is no LCO, there is no foundation, none of that other crap that tends to kind of bog down a lot of other projects, I think, and kind of set their directions. So Monero community and its developer community in particular decide where we want to take this project, how we want to do development, what we want to put in it, what we want to leave out, and all that. So we have a ton of different volunteers who do all sorts of things like outreach, translations, development, research. Some people do, however, kind of go above and beyond and want to do larger projects that kind of require a lot more of their time. So some projects, often smaller ones, sometimes big ones, are in fact funded entirely by community donations. So we have a system called the Forum Funding System, which is currently being overhauled. If you have an idea for something that you would like funding for in Monero, you can go and propose that project, get feedback on it, we'll open it to funding. Folks can just donate Monero to it, and then that's released to you in milestones as you do your project. Some people, in fact, kind of take that a little bit further, and I'm one of those people who does completely full-time work. So do I work for the Monero Research Lab? Well, no. The Monero Research Lab is not a legal entity. What it is the Monero Research Lab is a kind of work group of the Monero project that conducts and kind of coordinates research and development. It is technically independent from kind of the core developers who do work, so we get to set our own research directions for Monero. We are funded. There's actually 2 PhD researchers. I'm one of them. There's another one. We request full-time funding for them. So every 3 months, we basically put out a community donation funding request and say we'd like to continue researching. Here's what we've done. Here's what we'd like to do. And if people like what we've been doing, they can pay us. And if they don't have to. So Monero tries to be very much a meritocracy. Anyone who's willing to put forward work can do it, and support is done based on the quality of your work. So that's roughly kind of how Monero works ideologically. Yeah, question?
Yeah, this is really about kind of like the licensing. Is when Monero, GPL, or BSD or MIT or
there was a big switchover. I want to say we're BSD now. I feel like I should know that. Easily look it up. I know there was a transition at some point. A lot of the research-specific stuff that we do, not necessarily like the code base itself, but a lot of the side research that we do, most of that is in fact public domain.
Okay.
So yeah, try to keep it very open. So a few working definitions. I'm sure everyone already knows this, but in general, for our purposes, we're going to talk primarily about proof of work asset-based blockchains. So for our purposes, of course, a cryptographic asset is an asset where the integrity of the ledger itself is assured using cryptographic techniques. It's an append-only ledger. Typically, we use a blockchain. There's other research going into more general graph structures that we can definitely talk about later. Transactions, of course, are signed messages that transfer quantities of a particular asset from one account or entity to another. Those need to be added to the ledger. So miners, of course, collect transactions from others. They check the validity both internally and using their own knowledge of the ledger. They formulate it together in blocks. And in the case of proof of work chains, they use computing power and often significant electricity to basically compete for the right to add the next block. And yes, I know proof of stake is a thing. It's possibly many things. The asset projects we're going to talk about are kind of traditional proof of work chains. If we want to talk about that more, we can talk about it. And of course, the winning miner's block is added to the chain, and the protocol generally rewards the miner by generating new assets for it. So those are kind of our working definitions here. The reason we talk about these is because at kind of the beginning of this entire cryptocurrency experiment that the world's been doing for a while, there were a lot of assumptions made about, in particular, Bitcoin being kind of the first and largest asset, that it was, in fact, private or anonymous or any other number of definitions. Folks kind of assumed that because you don't operate using your name on the Bitcoin network, you instead operate using cryptographic keys, that somehow affords you a degree of anonymity. So, of course, the media and law enforcement jumped on it and said that, like, all the horrors of the world can be wrought and done by Bitcoin. I feel like we've now since moved on from that, I hope. In particular, because transactions are not done anonymously. They're done pseudo-anonymously. You might use the word pseudonymously is one that I really like. And there's a subtle difference between these. The difference between these two is if you're operating pseudo-anonymously or pseudonymously, all you're basically doing is renaming yourself. So in particular, if I'm operating on the Bitcoin network, transactions don't include my personal information unless I choose to interact with an exchange. But instead, I generate or have assigned to me one or more cryptographic keys. And the transactions that I make with those cryptographic keys are public on the ledger. So in particular, you can go to any number of blockchain explorers. Here's one I think I did back in February or something. And you can take a look at a particular transaction. It doesn't matter if you can see the details here or not. This is one particular transaction identified by a particular transaction hash here. And it shows a representation of the cryptographic key that sent the funds and the cryptographic key representations of the destinations, and in particular the amount. In this particular example, the total at that time in fiat equivalent of this transaction was like 6.8 million US dollars. Absolutely insane. But this is only pseudo-anonymity. I don't actually know who controls these cryptographic keys. However, you can go and look on the blockchain and you can find all the transactions that these particular cryptographic key entities engaged in with each other. And I did, and it turns out it's a lot of them. These entities send a lot of funds back and forth over a long period of time. But that's not anonymity. By anonymity, I mean that I want things like the sender, the receiver, and the amount of a transaction to be basically indistinguishable from those of others. A question?
Well, let's not do too many questions
Okay.
during the talk. So you want to save it, focus on for the Q&A
That's
session?
fine. If it's like a very short specific thing.
Yeah, can you actually tell what the transaction was, or is it just that you only can see the amount and
No,
the sender?
This is more or less the information.
Okay.
So there are subtle differences between them. In particular, what I would like, and my working definition of something that means that I am in fact anonymous, is that even if you knew what my cryptographic keys were, if I published them and told you what they were, that you would still not be able to gain this type of information. Ideally, you should not be able to look at a public blockchain and see, for example, which transactions I engaged in, where I sent funds, if I sent them at all, and in particular, what the amounts of those transactions are. So Bitcoin does not offer that. However, other projects have attempted to do so. But does this matter? If none of this matters, then Bitcoin is fine, we should be using it. But there's a lot of analysis that can be done. There are companies who exist solely to do this kind of analysis on Bitcoin and related open transparent chains. In particular, there's a lot of analysis you can do surrounding the nature and metadata of the transactions. One thing is, for example, input clustering. So if a Bitcoin transaction essentially merges a bunch of people's funds, a bunch of cryptographic keys funds and sends them off somewhere, you can safely assume that one entity controls all those inputs. This basically lets you start to form kind of graphs of addresses that are linked together that may control funds. We know in particular that you can cluster transaction outputs. Typically what you'll do is you'll send funds to a destination, which is often another entity, and you'll often send some change back to yourself. So even though that change might be to a unique new address, you can still kind of start linking together what's happening with these funds and who you suspect controls them. What's becoming extremely popular are cross-asset exchanges. Good examples of this are things like Morph Token or Shapeshift or any number of them, where you can basically do, so I put cross-chain in quotation marks. It's not true cross-chain swaps here. It's basically saying there's an entity that will accept funds in one particular digital asset and it'll pay me back in another one. There's a recent paper that came out that did several examples of tracking, I think it was Shapeshift and one other entity, I don't remember which one it was. They tried to track and understand what exactly was going on with their transactions, and they did a lot of work on it. This came out of University College London. We can look at what exchanges in particular are doing. Exchanges transact a ton of money between a bunch of different entities, and there's a lot of information that can be gained from that. Even things like mixers, that can, in some sense, imply some kind of shared responsibility when we're looking at kind of trying to regulate what's happening with finances. And one thing that's really interesting, and one of the, I think the biggest reasons that we don't want to use a transparent blockchain is something that's called poisoning or output tainting. Namely, perhaps I'm interacting with another entity and sending them funds, but of course, because it's a transparent chain, we can see where those funds that I have came from and where the funds came from prior to that. You can basically trace these funds throughout their entire history. Well, where did the funds originally come from? Were they from some kind of ransomware attack or some kind of, like, I don't know, shady drug deal or whatever the latest thing the local news is freaking out about? Well, if funds originally came from a source that is probably more unsavory and eventually got to me, an exchange could later say, well, that particular output, we're not going to accept it anymore because it was involved in a drug transaction, for example. So even though I might have nothing to do with a particular unsavory action, the funds that I have could be part of one, and it's very easy for an exchange to blacklist that. So we have evidence that exchanges have started to do these kind of things. So that means in particular that those funds are not fungible, they're not interchangeable, and that's not good. So in general, what this tells us is that it is not a good idea to assume Bitcoin and other transparent style ledgers offer any realistic anonymity whatsoever. You can literally build graphs of this stuff and look them up. A lot of research goes into this. So I like to think of a distributed blockchain-based asset ledger as having like some kind of different scales. So when people talk about what does it mean to be, private or closed off or open or transparent or whatever, well, I like to look at it in terms of both availability of access to the blockchain and also the visibility of information on it. And the visibility of information is what I really mean when I talk about anonymity and privacy versus pseudo-anonymity. So most chains that we deal with, like Bitcoin, Litecoin, Zcash, Monero, those chains are available. You can go and download that chain from any number of peers. You can examine it as much as you want, glean whatever information you can from it. However, those chains may be public or they may be private, meaning the information on them, things like the sender, the recipient, and the amount of the transactions, may be visible or not. In Bitcoin, kind of a lot of the first initial attempts at doing cryptographic assets, all of this was public. We already saw examples of that. You can see everything you'd ever want to know about the transaction, except for maybe the real-world identities of individuals. but you may be able to find that out through other means. What we want is we want private. That is, I want the information to not be distinguishable, even though it is available to everyone to download or obtain. So Bitcoin, for example, is both open and public. Of course, there are other examples of closed chains that may be used for more private purposes, but we're not going to be as interested in this. So our goal is that we want a ledger that is both open, meaning anyone can access it, that makes it distributed, that's kind of in I think, the original spirit of what blockchain-based assets were supposed to do, but I want it to be private. I want it to be private because I don't want to suffer from any of those other analysis methods, and I certainly, even though I may not be up to no good, I definitely don't want assets that I obtained from somewhere else to be tainted or poisoned and then blacklisted by an exchange. That makes it almost useless to me. We also need it to be easy to use, and we're going to see that that's kind of a trade-off that a lot of projects have to make, Monero included. We'll see what that means. However, there are several really good examples of different technological approaches in use, and that's going to be the main topic of this talk. The downside to this, as we're going to see, is that there are always trade-offs. Any asset project that says that they have got the entire thing figured out from all sides, they're probably trying to sell you something. Monero's not selling you anything, so I'm going to tell you right now, like, we don't really fully have it figured out either. So, for example, privacy. This is often at odds with, for example, what law enforcement wants. Ask law enforcement what they would like. They would like to know exactly what's happening in the financial world. They would like to know what transactions are doing. That's often at odds with what a lot of projects want to do, which is try to keep that information safe and private, maybe not even for criminal purposes. So we want all of those things to be, we really want all these things ideally, but a lot of times that means that transparency has to be thrown out. This is often at the cost of efficiency. And efficiency can mean many different things. People often like to talk about scalability, but they often don't really define what that means. By scalability or efficiency, I mean that transactions should not take a lot of time to complete. They also should not take a lot of time to verify if I'm an entity that verifies transactions on the chain. I want my blockchain not to get too big. This is kind of one of the big sticking points with a lot of projects. Space also, including space and time, for example, often lead into requirements for devices that can interact with the network. So some projects, for example, you probably can't use a mobile phone to do transactions. For example, shielded Zcash transactions that we'll talk about. Until very recently, you could not do that on a mobile phone. Is that bad for usability? I say it definitely is. So a lot of times it's difficult to get all of these at the same time. And a more subtle aspect that I've started thinking about a lot more lately is what I call the tyranny of movement. And that means that if users have to make choices about how to interact with and use your digital asset project, they're going to do whatever the default thing is. Absolutely. Many examples of this. If I have to make choices about the level of privacy or the way that I interact with a blockchain, for example, if there's a default thing, it needs to be the correct thing. So if you're designing something, which a lot of us are in this space, we need to make sure that correct user behavior does not necessarily impact the effects on those users. So I want to make sure that whatever the default option is, that it is also the safe and correct option, which is surprisingly difficult to do sometimes. So we got like all these things kind of fighting against each other. So how do we actually do it? Let's look at several different case studies, one of which will be Monero, hooray, some of which will not, and we'll see how they took different approaches to kind of achieve the same thing, you know, an open private ledger, and why they definitely have drawbacks, including some attacks. So has anyone heard of ZeroCoin? Excuse me. So a couple people. ZeroCoin was kind of, among other things, kind of the predecessor. Excuse me. ZeroCoin was a digital asset protocol, not just an asset or project on its own. But it was a protocol that was the predecessor to the Zero Cash protocol, which is what Zcash was based on. So you can kind of think about this as like the grandfather or grandmother of Zcash, but it's also been used directly in some asset projects. So it was actually developed in 2013 originally by some of the same folks who worked on Zcash later as an extension to the Bitcoin ecosystem. And the idea was to allow for a zero-knowledge asset transfer. So no information leakage, if possible, of assets. Kind of, I think, the first big attempt to do an open but private ledger. There are two things you can do with this in the original implementation. You could mint a ZeroCoin, and you could spend a ZeroCoin. You could not directly interact with kind of private assets among themselves. You always had to kind of move into and out of the transparent Bitcoin ecosystem. So in the case of a minting transaction, we would first basically burn a fixed quantity of open transparent Bitcoin by signing a particular minting transaction. So what you do is you pick a random value and another random value called a serial number to try to make it feel like a real coin. And you would produce using a cryptographic commitment, which is almost like a form of hashing, but it's not terribly important what. But there'd be an obfuscation operation. And that obfuscation operation would basically produce what you call a zero coin. So it's kind of this encrypted looking blob of information. You throw that up on the chain somehow, you're good to go. To later spend a 0 coin, well, you can't spend a 0 coin to another 0 coin if it didn't support that. Instead, you basically would spend a 0 coin to recover the original fixed quantity of Bitcoin again. So think of it as a money laundering service, which sounds awful, but that's basically what it was. Money laundering. You can do it for good reasons too. But to do that, the person spending would not actually identify the original 0 coin that was minted. That would give away information about the sender. So instead, the spender provided the serial number that was originally used. They also provide a proof that that serial number corresponded to some 0 coin that had been earlier minted, without actually identifying which one it was. The 0 coins themselves were not identified by serial number on the blockchain, but instead by this kind of blob of cryptographic data. So you instead provide a zero-knowledge proof that the serial number that you were spending existed somewhere and had not been spent previously. And then, of course, a transaction message saying where you were sending it on the Bitcoin chain. So a very cool attempt. Some really neat math that really hadn't been applied this way before, but there were definitely some problems with it. Some of these problems have been attempted to be addressed or in the process of being addressed, and some have not. In particular, there was a trusted setup. We know this, if you know what Zcash is, for example, you've probably heard the phrase trusted setup all over the place. But what that meant was that this hidden coin pool that was used to try to obscure the origination of a 0 coin used what's called an RSA number. And an RSA number, there was a big factoring contest that was done by the company behind the original RSA cryptographic ecosystem, where they basically took a gigantic number that I'll actually show you in a second and said, if you can factor this number into primes, it's huge, we'll give you like $200,000. No one's been able to do it so far. It's very, very costly and hard to do. And so the folks who started this decided, okay, we're going to use that number to just kind of set up the original bootstrapping of this hidden coin. The math requires it. How unfortunate. Supposedly, there's plans to move past this and not require a trusted setup, but it hasn't been finalized yet. So we didn't trust the folks who set it up. Maybe you don't trust the ecosystem. That spend proof that we talked about, proving that you knew about some 0 coin that you could spend, it was very costly in terms of space, so the chain would grow pretty fast. Verification of that transaction, which, well, if you're going to download a chain and verify that everything is okay, you don't want that to take very long. In this case, the verifying time took not an obscene amount of time, but more time than you'd want. And in particular, you could only do fixed amounts. So like 1 Bitcoin or 1/10 of a Bitcoin, one fixed asset amount at a time. Not very flexible, not what we want out of an ideal asset. This, by the way, is that RSA number. The whole contest, the whole security behind 0 coin relies on the fact that hopefully no one knows how to factor this gigantic single number. As far as we know, no one has. If you have, you should call me, because I would like to know that. This is what the trusted setup was. The 0 coin folks didn't do the trusted setup themselves. They used a known large number that actually has a name, RSA-24D. You can look it up. But there was a practical attack recently found on this. And it dealt with the fact that the serial number was not guaranteed to have been chosen randomly. When you're minting a 0 coin, you get to decide what the serial number is. It is assumed that you'll pick a random one that's going to be hard to guess later on, but in some sense it doesn't really matter. So suppose that we have a malicious attacker, Mallory. Let's suppose that Mallory is able to intercept Alice's spending. So maybe Mallory's some kind of like trusted node for Alice, maybe Mallory's Alice's ISP. There's tons of different roles Mallory can play. Well, let's suppose that Mallory could intercept Alice's spend proof for a particular serial number. Remember, the serial number itself is included publicly as part of that spend proof. So Mallory generates a new coin, mints a new 0 coin for himself with the same serial number. This doesn't have to be random. But then Mallory immediately spends that coin to himself, pays a tiny fee amount to get the transaction on the chain, but not a whole lot. Well, then, if Mallory lets Alice's honest spend go through to the network, Alice's spend is then rejected as a double spend attack because a coin with that serial number was already spent. So, not great. Effectively, what happened, Alice's coin got burned. No funds were stolen, but you could burn someone else's money for a very small transaction fee. Not good. A lot of different projects that implemented this 0 coin protocol were vulnerable to it. Some of these I had never heard of. If you have, you know more about this than I do already. Some projects like Hexcoin, Zoning, SmartCash, and Zcoin I'd not heard of. Pivx I had heard of. They were actually able to patch it in advance. They knew about it in advance to do an audit. So they were not vulnerable to this. But a lot of other projects were. It was pretty bad. And the fix for it was not necessarily that easy. So not great. Then we moved on. 0 coin eventually gave way to another protocol called Zero Cash, which tried to fix a lot of these problems that we talked about, a lot of the downsides, and was later implemented as the particular asset Zcash by the 0 coin electric Coin Company, whatever the Zcash company is actually called. They have a fun name. I love it. Zcash came out in 2014, so not that long after ZeroCoin. And it's based on the Zero Cash protocol. They've since heavily modified it, so Zcash is both kind of a protocol and a digital asset. You can trade it if you want. What they did is kind of like in ZeroCoin. It was intended to be kind of a Bitcoin sidechain, but now it's kind of just its own thing. Well, it basically uses two different pools or types of addresses. One of them is called transparent, and one of them is called shielded. And they're called that for a reason. So if you decide to do a transaction that is the transparent pool, it works exactly like in Bitcoin, exactly the same thing. There is no privacy. You can see sender, recipient amount. All those transactions are public with a fixed amount of Zcash being transitioned between two different known cryptographic keys. The shielded pool, though, that actually does hide the sender and the receiver. It hides the sender and receiver within a full anonymity set. It is not possible to determine who the sender and receiver are, even in terms of their cryptographic keys. All you can tell is that some entity sent some unknown quantity of Zcash to some other unknown entity. So the amount is also obscure. So these are fully private transactions. Can't tell where they're coming from or going to, can't tell the amount. You can also transition in between these pools. So you can take stuff that was in the public pool with a known amount, and then transition it to an unknown destination in the private pool, after which it's contained therein. You can also bring stuff back out of the shielded pool in a de-shielded transaction from an unknown address to a known address with a known amount. So there's different ways to interact with this project, which means you have to make some choices about how you want to interact with it. Unfortunately, the initialization of the Zcash system did also require a trusted setup process. If you're familiar with Zcash at all, you know that they did a big multi-party computation thing in like hotel rooms of the woods, and it was a whole big thing. Like NPR did a story on it. They destroyed their computers, whatever. But there was a trusted setup. That, if that trusted setup was not done properly or correctly, would allow the creators of it to print their own Zcash just for free, undetectably. We have no idea if that is true or not. That depends on your level of trust in the company that did it, but it's a consequence of the way that they initialized it. The technology behind this that actually lets them do all of this shielded stuff, it's an implementation of a zero-knowledge proving system of a class called zk-SNARKs you may have heard of. It stands for zero knowledge, succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge, if you care about that. It's a snark if you don't care about that. It's this kind of like big, shiny new move map that they invented in order to do much more general zero-knowledge proving. So they were able to solve a lot of the problems ZeroCoin had. You can just transact in between private addresses, which ZeroCoin couldn't do. You can do arbitrary amounts, which ZeroCoin couldn't do. There's none of that kind of shady serial number stuff that kind of plagued ZeroCoin originally. So what is zk-SNARK? Everyone always asks this all the time. They're like, what's a zk-SNARK? And I'm like, it works great. They're like, but what is it? I'm like, it's fine, it works great. In general, it is a type of proving system. So when someone says, we want to include zk-SNARKs, it's like, well, you're really talking about a class of proving systems. And what they do is they let you prove certain things about structures called arithmetic circuits. An arithmetic circuit can be thought of as kind of a representation of a particular system or statement using different inputs and different operations. You can do all sorts of representations of it. Roughly speaking, you take a statement that you want to prove. In the case of Zcash, it's a statement that involves certain sending and receiving and balance operations, all the statements that involve a transaction being done correctly. It takes all that statement, represents it in this kind of arithmetic circuit format, which is much more complicated than the teeny little example I have here. You do a transformation into a particular representation called polynomial representation. You use a fancy sampling method, blah, blah, blah. No more details than this. It works great. However, the trusted setup process, the reason they had to do that was that long, big setup process they did with Zuko Wilcox in the woods or whatever. What that did was that basically generated certain encrypted forms of particular private data. And the fact is, like, the structure that was enabled by this particular trusted setup is what allows the proofs to be really small. So they also use this trusted setup and this particular zk-SNARK short proving system in order to fix some of those original ZeroCoin problems involving transaction size and verification time. So it turns out statements in Zcash using the zk-SNARK proving system are both extremely tiny, like super teeny tiny, and they are very, very fast to check. However, for a long time, they were extremely complex, very lengthy in order to do the proving. So if you wanted to make a transaction, this is why you couldn't do it on a mobile phone. It was not easy to generate these zk-SNARK-based proofs without a lot of computational power and memory, unfortunately. You could verify everything on a phone, good for you, but you couldn't do the generation, so it made it less useful. But there are other forms of zero-knowledge proving systems. This is not the only one. I have an example I like to call ZK Waldo. So let's suppose that I want to be able to prove something in zero knowledge. What does that mean? Well, a lot of projects are going nuts now. They're saying, like, we want to go zero knowledge, but they don't really define what that means. Well, there's technical definitions behind this, but generally, a zero-knowledge proof is some kind of generated mathematical structure, and it lets a prover, generally the person who wants to make a transaction, convince a verifier, who is typically just someone who wants to verify that the blockchain they downloaded is correct, about the truth of a particular statement, generally involving a transaction. But they don't want to reveal any other information about the statement itself. So I basically want to be able to convince you that some transaction involving unknown amounts, senders, and recipients is accurate, balanced, and correct without telling you anything else about it, which on its face seems like the most ridiculous thing in the world. How could you possibly do that? Well, many statements you want to be able to prove involve things like the asset spent in this transaction exists somewhere on the blockchain. There's a mathematical way to represent that. In particular, sometimes things involving balance involve statements like this hidden transaction amount represents a number that is not negative, which you might want to make sure you're not printing free money. It's important to note, though, that having a zero-knowledge proof system, like the ZK Snark-enabled system or something else, this does not automatically give you a complete transaction-based asset. Everyone assumes that, like, if I know what a ZK Snark is, I can magically build a new asset out of it. It's not true. You can prove different things about those transactions, but it's a lot more work. Why is Waldo here? Waldo's here because, like, a great example about, like, how I can prove something to someone in zero knowledge is the following. If you're familiar with the Waldo series of books, which I am, it's a giant picture involving all sorts of people, and your goal is to find Waldo, this guy. It's called Where's Waldo? Find Waldo. Suppose that I, in particular, have found Waldo. I want to convince you that I know where Waldo is, but I don't want to tell you where Waldo is. So what do? I have you turn around. I take a giant piece of cardboard, and I cut out a little Waldo-shaped hole in my piece of cardboard. And I stick that cardboard over the page of the book, so that all you can see is Waldo through the hole. You turn around, you look through the cardboard, and you're like, aha, I see Waldo there. Obviously, you knew where Waldo was, or you wouldn't have been able to put the cardboard there. But if you turn around and I take that cardboard away, you now do not have the information needed to prove that to somebody else. So that's an example of a very simple, a sort of zero-knowledge proof system involving a statement about where Waldo is. So a ZK Snark is where's Waldo. It's easy. But that's an example. So has Zcash figured it all out? Well, I think they figured out a lot of things that ZeroCoin didn't have. They had downsides involving the trusted setup, of course. Whether or not you're okay with that depends on your particular trust model with this company. But there are a lot of other attacks that deal with the fact that privacy in Zcash is optional. So, in particular, shielded transactions used to be very expensive to generate. They recently did a network upgrade, so that statement's really not necessarily true anymore. Now shielded transactions are much, much simpler to do. But as a result of this, and as a result of other regulatory questions, a lot of exchanges did not support shielded operations. So if you wanted to interact with an exchange, which a lot of people do, because fiat's important, if you wanted to do that, you had to bring your stuff back out into the transparent pool again, and that revealed a lot of information. So people had to make a lot of choices about how to use this. In particular, one thing that they often did is they did use the shielded pool kind of as a money laundering service. So suppose that Alice wants to get funds to Carol, but doesn't want it to be a direct link between them. What she might do is she might send funds over to Bob or to herself into the shielded pool. So perhaps she sends a known amount of 15 Zcash into the shielded pool. A small amount goes out as a fee, maybe 0.0001 Zcash as the miner or transaction fee. But then immediately wants to take it back out to Carol, with the idea being that if it went through the shielded pool, then maybe we don't know where it came from. Well, we can see that there's a transaction from some place in the shielded pool, we don't know where, out to a known address, maybe to Carol this time. And we can see that the amount for that was 14.9998 Zcash. Well, what metadata does this give me? Well, what I can see is that 15 Zcash went into the shielded pool, and then shortly thereafter, 14.9998 Zcash came out of the shielded pool. And I know generally what transaction fees are, so maybe I would link that together and say, well, that's clearly one transaction laundered through the shielded pool. That's a lot of information. There were a couple different papers that have come out on this that said that even though we know that most transactions in Zcash are fully transparent, because they used to be faster that way, the very small amount of transactions that were completely private, among those, a huge portion of them could be linked uniquely in this way. Just by using time analysis and the amounts leaving the shielded pool, you account for fees. So there's a lot of metadata that comes from the idea that if you use this as a money laundering service, for good or for evil, whatever, you can get a lot of info out. So why can you do this? because privacy was optional. Not good. Zcash has since said that, if you only interact with the shielded pool, never do this whole in and out thing, then you're going to be fine. But that's not realistically how people used it, because it was not the easiest option. If it's not the easiest option, it's not going to be what people are going to do. And there, of course, are other attack vectors that are very much related to the fact that transparent transactions work just like in Bitcoin. So a lot of Bitcoin analysis methods work here. Clustering of inputs and output addresses. Looking at how exchanges interact with it. They have a particular founder reward where, for at least a while, a portion of every Zcash that was mined went to the founders of the Zcash company and their allies, whoever else they were working with. So they had particular addresses that you could do tagging on with that too. In my mind, the model behind this is that in general, optional privacy is not a good idea. It opens up way too much metadata that you can use to do a whole lot of analysis. And it is worth noting, in fairness, they did deploy a protocol upgrade. It was like a couple weeks ago or something. It was really, really recently. They did make sure their transactions are a whole lot more efficient to encourage their use. Whether or not that means exchanges will support them remains to be seen. I hope they do. I think that Zcash doing this was a very good idea for their users. Let's go to Monero. The big shiny example, right? Well, we'll look at some benefits to Monero's approach and some weaknesses to Monero's approach too. It takes a much different track than Zcash and Zero. So generally, Monero is a cryptographic asset. I said cryptocurrency here, even though I hate that word. It takes a pretty hard line now. This did not used to be the case, but it is the case now, that it does not allow transparent transactions at all. Monero has had a lot of different iterated developments on this kind of over the short number of years that it's existed. But at this point, transactions must effectively be all private. So the way it works, unlike Zcash, where you get basically full anonymity within the shielded pool of sender, recipient, and amount, in Monero, it's almost that, but not quite. So the recipient is essentially fully anonymous. So you can't identify who the recipient is just by looking at a transaction on the chain. The amounts are hidden, what's also called a cryptographic commitment, sort of like zero coin-ish. So you can't tell what the amounts of the transaction are, even though you know it balances properly. Senders, however, are anonymous only within a small group. And that is the reason for that is because we don't need a trusted setup in order to do that. So we kind of take a layered approach to how we do these, not just kind of one big proving system like a zk-SNARK. The different ones we use are something called a ring signature. Is what's used to obfuscate senders within a small fixed group of senders. Something called one-time or stealth addresses that make the recipient fully anonymous. And what's sometimes called a confidential transaction model, which is originally developed, intended to be used on Bitcoin, which wasn't, that hides amounts. So it's a layered approach. So one-time addresses mean that in Monero, addresses, so my particular Monero address, which you could actually look up if you were curious, that address never, ever appears on the blockchain. Instead, every single transaction that is intended for me generates a particular one-time address that cannot be linked mathematically back to my original kind of true address, you might say. So if I'm sending funds to someone multiple times, the recipient's apparent one-time address looks random and unique every single time. However, if I have control of my true address, which I do if I'm having funds sent to me, that basically gives me some kind of spending authority for funds. So I can look at a particular one-time address on the chain. I can determine if it was directed at me because I hold the particular secret keys. And I can also go and use that as a kind of spend authority to spend those funds later. So this effectively mitigates against some forms of transaction linking by making every single destination look unique. So that's how one-time addresses work. Other projects have done integrations similar to this as well. I think Monero is probably like the biggest example of one that does this. Now, ring signature is, in some sense, a kind of zero-knowledge proof, depending on your technical definition of that. And a ring signature, like I said, obscures the sender of a transaction. The way it does that is it basically provides a form of a proof that one out of a particular group of one-time addresses is being spent in a transaction. So really what happens is a transaction basically pulls in other random-looking one-time addresses that I don't necessarily even control, and just proves that one of those among that random-looking group was the one that was spent. But it doesn't tell you which one it was. So the selection of decoys, unlike a lot of mixers that are used in Bitcoin-style assets, is completely non-interactive. I don't have to sit around and wait for other users to mix in coins with me. It doesn't work like that. I basically just pick them arbitrarily off the chain. I generate this ring signature that says one of these was the true spender, but I'm not telling you which one, and then it works out. So and it's worth noting, though, that these are one-time addresses. These are not true addresses. So a lot of people say you're obscured within a group of senders. No, your sending is obscured within a group of one-time addresses. Those one-time addresses, remember, cannot be linked back to a wallet. So it's, again, kind of a layered approach to sending security. And finally, the confidential transaction model. Monero, it's often called ring CET for ring confidential transactions. basically hides the amounts that are used in cryptographic commitments. What that means is that an observer or verifier on the chain can be assured that all the transactions balance, that is, no money is being created or lost, but they still gain no other information about the input or output amounts. They just know that they balance properly, which really is what we want. The reason that works is you can do some kind of fancy looking algebra on those cryptographic commitments, so there is no fun business. And the result of this whole layered scheme approach says that some transaction output in some fixed group spent an unknown quantity of Monero to some unknown destination. So the idea is that you cannot do things transparently. The protocol does not allow it. As a result, it does mean that the code base is entirely unique from that of Bitcoin, so a lot of integrations are a little bit more challenging because Monero's protocols work very, very differently than a lot of other original assets like Bitcoin and Islam. So what could go wrong with this? On its face, you might think, that's fantastic. You've clearly solved all the problems that we looked at from all these other projects. Well, having this small sender anonymity set is what tends to be the problem. In general, it is not a problem. In general, having this small sender anonymity set is okay as long as one-time addresses are not known to be spent or unspent. Remember, I'm basically taking a bunch of random transaction outputs, and I'm saying that one of these was spent in a transaction. But if I know that one of those decoys was already spent in a previous transaction, well, I know it wasn't spent again. So the size of your anonymity set depends heavily on not knowing if one-time addresses have already been spent. So the idea is that in Monero, we don't have an unspent transaction output or UTXO set. Ideally, you just have a TXO set, just a set of transaction outputs, and you don't know if they've been spent or not. Well, what classes of outputs can we know are spent? Well, if you're an attacker and you generate a bunch of just random looking outputs on the chain, you know if those are spent or unspent. So if you see them appearing later in a ring signature, you know if they're real or not. The way that we do double spend protection means that, in particular, forks of the Monero blockchain, which some groups have tried to do, generally as money grabs, if you spend funds on many forks at once, it can reduce the effective ring size. We can talk about it later if you really want. There's always the problem of controlled purchases, that addresses that are sent to you in controlled purchases and later spent on a compromised exchange could reveal some information. And one thing that we dealt with recently is that the way that you choose your decoys, if that doesn't match the typical spending patterns of how people actually spend funds, you can often infer those, but not prove that those are likely already spent. However, it's worth noting that a lot of this stuff basically gives you heuristics. A ring signature does exactly what it says in the box. It's a rough proving system that tells you that one out of a given set was spent in a transaction. Some of these just give you heuristics. They give you kind of inferences about what might be a true spend, but they don't give you provable information. And that's something to keep in mind. What they do is they provide a level of obfuscation, and they give a degree of plausible deniability to a spend. It is worth noting too that the effects of ring signatures over time, they depend very, very heavily on choice of parameters. Monero in particular has increased the size of its anonymity set and changed that over time in order to kind of mitigate against some of these attacks. So now your ring choice is basically a fixed size in an attempt to further obfuscate transaction data. So how do we mitigate against this? How is Monero mitigated against some of these various forms of not good spend information? Well, a couple papers came out that said, aha, we know that a lot of old outputs, when we didn't require full anonymity, we know that those are already spent. Well, that's true, that's not good. But fortunately, those old legacy outputs, those are not used as decoys, as possible decoy senders in modern transactions, based on the way that we choose them. So tons of papers come out saying, oh my god, 70% of all Monero one-time addresses are traceable over time. Well, that has nothing to do with current, modern transactions, because those are not used as decoys. Well, we know that multi-fork outputs, we said, can be often identified as spent. Well, you can increase ring sizes, and that means that the effects of other people doing that on fork have very, very little impact on you, someone who is not so stupid as to spend on multiple forks. Well, some transactions stand out. So we used to let you pick the size of your anonymity set. Most people would choose a default of 5 or 7, but occasionally you get someone to be like, my ring size is 192. You're like, why would you do that? I don't know. Someone just decided 192 is super private. But what that meant is, if you saw another transaction later with a ring size of 192, you're like, oh, it's the 192 guy. That's information. That's metadata you don't want to get out there. So if transactions stand out like that, fine. We're going to enforce certain parameters. Now you don't get to choose what your ring size is. It is now fixed at 11. Turn it up to 11. Yeah. That was a little marketing. That was our really bad attempt at marketing. It's our Spinal Tap release. But it's enforced. If you try to do a 192 ring, it'll be rejected by the network as standing out too much. We talked a little bit about kind of decoy timing and saying that you should choose your decoys according to the ways that people actually spend things. Well, it turns out we've been iterating on that for a while. There was some analysis that was done on both the Bitcoin blockchain as well as some old Monero outputs that were able to identify how people spend funds. In particular, people tend to spend newer funds a lot more often than older funds. So you should pick newer funds as decoys more often. So you can do a bunch of math on that, and we have. So it's a constant iteration process. So I'm not saying we have all this solved, but I'm saying that there are mitigations that we're very, very aware of to fix some of the problems with small anonymity sets that we have. And again, why do we have this and not a full Zcash style anonymity set? Well, we don't know how to do that without a trusted set. And in general, the Monero community has said there should be no trust in anybody, ideally. And we try to do that as much as possible. So what is the current state of the art? We've seen throughout history in like 8 years, about how people have done this. Long, long history. So what's the current state of the art right now? Well, for starters, the current state of the art is always evolving. If you're in this space as a researcher, you know that there are a whole lot of different new approaches that are coming out that kind of iterate on old approaches or take wild new tacks. Well, current trends tend to evolve. It's kind of a broad generalization, one of which is efficiency choices. And I said, of course, that efficiency is something you got to make decisions on. Well, a lot of time that depends on centralized or distributed trust. You can generally make a distributed asset a lot more efficient if you're willing to sacrifice trust for it. Zcash, you sacrifice a lot of trust, but you gain a lot of efficiency now. In Monero, it is widely distributed, does not have centralized trust, but you pay for it with a smaller limited anonymity set, which can have problems if not done correctly. A lot of approaches take the idea of choosing to do either a mixing of an existing protocols, like a Bitcoin mixer, for example, whatever style of mixing you choose to do, versus a newer protocol that does not involve mixing. So Monero, Zcash, and ZeroCoin, for example, are able to do a lot better privacy without relying on mixers. So, I mean, a good takeaway for Monero is a ring signature is not a mixer. It doesn't work like that. Mixers have a lot of their own other issues. But you can tack them on really easily to older protocols. These ones, you can't just tack them on to older protocols very easily. It doesn't work nicely. And finally, try to figure out good ways to do spending anonymity. Things like ring signatures, or better ways to do them. Or structures like cryptographic accumulators, which is what ZeroCoin originally used. There's a lot of different ways to do sender anonymity, and we're still trying to figure out the best way to do it without trust in an efficient way. So Monero, for example, we know good ways to make ring signatures a lot more secure and private, but you pay for it massively with efficiency and size. So it's always a trade-off. Ideally, we want a solution that involves no trust. So you shouldn't have to trust a company to have done a kind of starting ceremony correctly. We ideally want something that's fully zero knowledge, that for a transaction, while it can be verified as being correct, doesn't give away any information about the sender, the recipient, the amount. We want high anonymity, where we don't want to be limited by smaller anonymity sets that have their own problems. We want low metadata, which means that like leakages involving transaction timing or fees don't harm users. And in particular, we want all this to be efficient. So we want like Zcash levels of efficiency with Monero levels of trustlessness, which is a huge tall order. So by no means are we done with this. I mean, Monero has done some things to try to address things like efficiency with our launch of bulletproofs, for example, as kind of a portion of our ring CT scheme. Zcash recently did a protocol upgrade that actually switched out their entire proving system for one that's more efficient, which is great. Pivx, which uses a form of ZeroCoin's protocol, they're supposedly working on some stuff with cryptographic accumulators. They don't tell anyone about it, so I don't know if it's true or not. We'll see. Proof's in the pudding, right? So there's a lot of different approaches that are being taken here. There is no silver bullet. No one's figured this out yet. But there's a lot of things that we're working on to try to keep things as safe as possible for our users, consistent with our ideology and thoughts on things like trust. That's kind of where we are now. So, my big pro tips. There's a ton of different projects that come out that say like, oh my God, we solved it. Give you a hint, it probably didn't solve it. But here's what you should look out for, in my opinion. First, make sure that a project that gives you some guarantees of privacy actually defines what that means. It is really, really subtle to say private and not say what that means. So you should really watch out for claims that are very broad or very vague and don't include a lot of like very, very specific definitions. So you can formalize a lot of things about privacy, like cryptographically and mathematically. And if they don't do that, they probably haven't thought about it well enough. Second, privacy cannot be optional. It is too easy to leak metadata if you do not have required privacy. In some sense, Monero has optional transparency. You can always give away information about a transaction to someone else. That's fine. That's your choice. But in an asset like Zcash, for example, you have to choose if you're going to be private or not. As we already saw, that comes with consequences. It's a one-way street, though. If you lose anonymity and fungibility, you can't get it back. One-way street. Third, integrations. They're very tricky and they're very, very subtle. A lot of times you see like an existing project that's like, we're going to add ZK snarks. And then it's like, you ask, what does that mean? You're just going to stick them on there with some glue, and they're like, oh, it's fine. We've got the whole thing figured out. Well, I'll give you a hint here. Building a cryptographic system is not like building a Lego house. You can't be like, I'm adding a new room on my Lego house. It fits in perfectly because they're Legos. Cryptography does not always work like that. There are some things that you can swap out and add on to a system. You have to be very, very careful about how it's done. It is super easy to get that wrong, and it's very hard to get it right. So if they don't treat it like something that needs to be done cautiously, they probably haven't thought it through. Flaws matter. A response matters too. This is, I think, one of the easiest ways to tell if something is a scam or not. If they have a problem, and that problem is pointed out, how do they respond? The correct way to respond is to say, thank you, we're looking into it, here are the details, we will publish information on them. If a researcher is not willing to discuss or address flaws, that's a giant red flag. I feel like most of the big projects we talked about do a really good job with that. You report an error problem, we're like, cool, we will work with you to fix this, here's a bug report. Thank you very much for your time. If you try to attack someone who's like trying to discuss research with you, not great. Second to last, make sure that the mathematics is vetted. So if something sounds too good to be true in mathematics, it almost always is too good to be true. So someone can show you a little white paper that's got fancy fonts on it and 3 pages of work, but no. Real cryptography is ugly, it is messy, it's formal mathematics, and that's the way that it has to be built. So make sure that the technology is actually properly vetted mathematics. It's harder than you might think. Finally, consider the trust level. So the structure of a particular protocol or of an asset or of an application is often really, really critically tied to the trust model of everyone involved. If everyone can trust a particular entity, like a company, to do a ZK snark-based setup properly, then maybe that's okay for that application. I would argue that a broadly distributed blockchain asset, like the ones we talked about, needs to have no trust. The participants should not be assumed to trust each other or any central entity. But for other applications, that may not be the case. So if there's a different trust profile or risk profile, maybe that affects the way that it's set up, and that could be okay. Those are things I would look up for. So if you're interested in this, Monero loves having people get involved. So getmonero.org will get you a link to, if you want to do any downloads, to start using Monero, or if you're interested in taking a look at the code, get access to the repos from there. Monero Research Lab, each of our researchers does some work jointly and some work on our own. This is in particular a short link to my personal research repository where we do other work. I'm always available by email at sarang@getmonero.org to talk about this stuff. Other than that, thank you for your time. I don't know about the time for questions, but I'm assuming we do have time for questions.
We do, but we're gonna have some other stuff first. So let's thank.
Sweet. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time then. And then we'll
Cool. So we're gonna sneak in one more lightning talk. Yep. We got.
does someone want to hit the power button on the projector up there? We couldn't find the remote.
Yeah. So we're gonna do one more lightning
good.
talk. Then we're gonna open the pizza boxes and commence with Q&A. All right. You got 2 minutes.
All right. Where should I go?
Right up there.
Just start.
Go.
Cool. Hey everybody, my name is Paul Cowgill. I'm working on a project called Tacit, T-A-S-I-T. It is helping to bring Ethereum dApps to mobile. So the idea is globally people who have phones and not laptops, and teams tend to use phone and not laptops, but today pretty much all dApps, decentralized apps for Ethereum, are built for the web only. There are some good permissionless reasons for this, but there are also there's mounting evidence that Apple, for instance, is going to be accepting lots of dApps. So I'm building first an SDK that makes this simple for kind of new devs to make dApps, and also building some dApps using that SDK. Yeah. If you want to find us, the website is tasit.io.
All right. Thank you.